What would you do if the person who sacrificed everything for your freedom was living forgotten, just a few blocks away from you? What if the hero who once stood between your family and danger now sits alone, wondering if anyone remembers his name? What if I told you that in every neighborhood across America, there's probably someone whose courage saved lives, but whose story remains untold? Today's story will challenge everything you think you know about gratitude, community, and the true meaning of heroism. In a quiet suburban neighborhood in Millfield, Ohio, where manicured lawns stretch endlessly and children's laughter echoes through perfectly planned streets, there lived a man who had become invisible. Frank Morrison, 73 years old, shuffled down the same cracked sidewalk every morning at exactly 7:15. His weathered hands, marked by old scars that told stories he never shared, clutched a small paper bag containing 2 pieces of stale bread. This was his daily offering to the pigeons at Memorial Park, a ritual that had become the most meaningful part of his day. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he never spoke of it to anyone. Memorial Park, built to honor fallen soldiers, had become his only companion in a world that had seemingly moved on without him. The bronze plaque at the entrance read, "Dedicated to those who gave all for freedom," yet Frank, who had given nearly everything, walked past it daily without anyone recognizing the living memorial in their midst. Frank had served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1968 and 1971. Earning a Purple Heart for wounds received during the Tet Offensive and a Bronze Star for valor after single-handedly evacuating 12 wounded soldiers under heavy enemy fire. But those medals now gathered dust in a shoebox under his bed, forgotten relics of a war most people preferred not to discuss. The only time he looked at them was on the anniversary of his best friend's death, when the weight of survivor's guilt became too heavy to bear alone. His small apartment above Murphy's hardware store was a testament to a life lived in quiet desperation. The walls were bare, except for a single faded photograph of his unit, 22 young men who believed they were invincible when the camera captured that moment in 1969. Frank was one of only 4 who made it home, and now, 5 decades later, he was the last one still breathing. The other 3 had succumbed to various demons, addiction, suicide, and cancer caused by Agent Orange exposure. The silence in that apartment was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of old floorboards and the distant hum of traffic below. Frank had grown accustomed to talking to himself, carrying on conversations with ghosts of friends who would never grow old. Sometimes, late at night, he would find himself recounting stories of their adventures to the empty room, his voice echoing off walls that had heard these tales countless times before. Every Tuesday, Frank would walk 6 blocks to Thompson's Grocery, counting every penny as he selected the cheapest items from the clearance section. His monthly Social Security check of $837 had to cover rent, utilities, food, and the medications that kept his war-damaged body functioning. After paying his bills, he usually had less than $40 left for food, which explained his steady diet of generic bread, peanut butter, and whatever vegetables were marked down for quick sale. The cashiers at Thompson's knew him by sight, but not by name. To them, he was just another elderly man struggling to make ends meet on a fixed income. Brenda, who worked the morning shift, would sometimes slip him an extra coupon or accidentally forget to ring up his cheapest item. Small acts of kindness that Frank noticed but never acknowledged directly. They had no idea that this quiet, unassuming figure had once carried wounded comrades through enemy fire, or that his trembling hands had performed field surgery under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. The neighborhood kids would sometimes see him sitting on his small balcony, staring into the distance with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. They would whisper among themselves, creating myths about the strange old man who lived above the hardware store. Some called him weird, others simply ignored him completely. Tommy Henderson, a 10-year-old who lived 3 houses down, once asked his mother why the old man always looked so sad. She shrugged and told him not to stare at strangers, never imagining that this stranger had once fought to protect the very freedom that allowed her son to play safely in their suburban paradise. Mrs. Chen, who ran the small flower shop on the corner, was perhaps the only person who showed Frank any genuine kindness. Every few weeks, she would slip him a small bouquet of wilted flowers that hadn't sold, telling him they were destined for the trash anyway. Frank would accept them gratefully, his voice barely above a whisper as he thanked her. He would place them in a mason jar by his window, where they would bring a brief splash of color to his gray existence and remind him that beauty still existed in the world, even if it was often overlooked or discarded. Mrs. Chen had escaped Vietnam as a refugee in 1975, but she had never connected her freedom to the sacrifices of soldiers like Frank. She simply saw him as a lonely old man who appreciated her small gestures, never knowing that he had been part of the military effort that indirectly led to her family's opportunity to start over in America. Their brief interactions were conducted in English, peppered with her native Vietnamese, words that Frank recognized but pretended not to understand, afraid that acknowledging his familiarity with her language might open doors to conversations he wasn't ready to have. On particularly difficult nights, when the memories became too vivid and sleep remained elusive, Frank would stand on his balcony and look out over the neighborhood he had called home for 15 years. He would see lights in windows, families gathered around dinner tables, children being tucked into bed, and couples settling down to watch television together. All of these simple moments of domestic peace were possible because people like him had been willing to stand between danger and innocence, yet none of these neighbors knew his name or his story. The loneliness was perhaps harder to bear than the physical pain from his old wounds. Frank's left leg still carried shrapnel that doctors had deemed too dangerous to remove, and cold mornings left him walking with a pronounced limp. His hearing had been damaged by explosions and gunfire, causing a constant ringing that served as a perpetual reminder of battles fought long ago. But it was the emotional wounds that cut deepest, the knowledge that his sacrifices seemed to mean nothing to a society that had moved on without looking back. One particularly cold morning in November, as Frank made his way to the park with his usual offering for the pigeons, he didn't notice the young woman following him with her camera phone. Sarah Martinez was a journalism student at Ohio State University's regional campus, working on a senior thesis project about forgotten heroes in American communities. She had been observing Frank for weeks, intrigued by his military posture, the way he still walked with his back straight despite his obvious pain, and how he saluted the flag at the park every single day without fail. Sarah had grown up in a military family. Her father had served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and she had seen firsthand how veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life. Something about Frank's solitary ritual struck her as both beautiful and heartbreaking. Here was a man who clearly understood honor and duty, yet he performed these acts of respect in complete isolation, with no one to witness or acknowledge his faithfulness. Her curiosity finally overcame her hesitation, and she approached Frank as he sat on his usual bench, surrounded by a dozen grateful pigeons who had come to depend on his daily visits. Her initial questions were met with suspicious silence and sideways glances. Frank had learned to be wary of strangers, especially young people with cameras, having seen too many news stories where veterans were portrayed as unstable or dangerous. But something in Sarah's genuine interest and respectful demeanor gradually broke down the walls Frank had built around his heart. She didn't ask intrusive questions about combat or trauma. Instead, she asked about the pigeons, about the park, about how long he had been coming there. Her approach was gentle, patient, and completely unlike the aggressive interviewing style he had expected. For the first time in years, someone wanted to hear his story, really hear it, not just offer polite nods and quick escapes. Sarah explained her project and asked if Frank would be willing to share some of his experiences. She promised complete control over what information would be used and assured him that her goal was to honor veterans' stories, not exploit them for sensational content. As Frank began to share fragments of his experiences, Sarah realized she had stumbled upon something extraordinary. This wasn't just another veteran's story. This was a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the tragic way society abandons its heroes once the parades are over. Frank's voice, barely above a whisper at first, grew stronger as he sensed Sarah's genuine interest and respect for his experiences. Over the next several weeks, Frank found himself looking forward to Sarah's visits with an anticipation he hadn't felt in decades. She would bring him coffee and pastries from the university cafe, and in return, he would share memories he had kept locked away for decades. He told her about the night he carried his wounded sergeant, Bobby Martinez, through 3 miles of hostile jungle, never mentioning that Bobby had been Sarah's uncle, a connection she wouldn't discover until much later. He spoke of the letter he still carried from Maria Santos, a young mother who had thanked him for bringing her 18-year-old son home alive after a firefight that claimed 6 other soldiers. Frank had performed field surgery on the boy using nothing but a pocket knife and strips torn from his own uniform, working by moonlight while enemy forces searched the area around them. The boy, now a grandfather himself, had never tried to contact Frank, but his mother's letter had meant everything to the young soldier who received it. Sarah was deeply moved by Frank's stories, but she was even more troubled by his current circumstances. Here was a man who had given everything for his country, now living in near poverty, forgotten by the very community he had served. The disconnect between his past heroism and present situation seemed to represent everything wrong with how America treats its veterans. She knew she had to do something more than just write an academic paper. Frank deserved better than scholarly recognition. He deserved to know that his sacrifices mattered, that his courage had made a difference, and that people still cared about the price he had paid for their freedom. Without telling Frank, Sarah began reaching out to local veterans organizations, starting with the American Legion post across town. When she called and described Frank's situation, the post commander was embarrassed and angry. They had been operating in the same community for 40 years without knowing that a decorated combat veteran was living in poverty just miles away. The commander immediately began making calls, reaching out to other veterans groups and community organizations. Sarah contacted the mayor's office, the local newspaper, and even Murphy, the hardware store owner who had been Frank's landlord for 15 years but knew nothing about his tenant's heroic past. She shared carefully edited recordings of Frank's stories, always respecting his privacy while conveying the magnitude of his service and sacrifice. The response was overwhelming and immediate. Within days, Sarah's inbox was flooded with messages from people who wanted to help. A local contractor, Tom Rodriguez, whose father had served in Vietnam, volunteered to renovate Frank's apartment free of charge. He had been looking for a way to honor his late father's memory, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Jennifer Thompson, whose family owned the grocery store where Frank shopped, was horrified to learn that a war hero had been struggling to afford food in her establishment. She immediately arranged for Frank to receive free groceries for life, though she planned to present this gift in a way that would preserve his dignity. The American Legion post, embarrassed that they hadn't known about Frank's situation, immediately began planning a proper recognition ceremony. They contacted the State Veterans Affairs Office, local politicians, and military officials, building momentum for what would become the largest Veterans Appreciation event in the county's history. But Sarah wanted something bigger, something that would truly show Frank how much his service meant to the community. She began organizing what she privately called Operation Recognition, a surprise celebration that would bring together everyone whose life had been touched by Frank's story. She contacted local media outlets, arranged for a military honor guard from the nearby Air Force base, and even tracked down surviving family members of the soldiers Frank had served with. The most challenging part was keeping the secret from Frank while ensuring that the celebration would honor him appropriately. Sarah worked with Mrs. Chen to gather information about Frank's preferences and personality, learning that he was deeply humble and would be uncomfortable with too much attention. The challenge was creating an event that would be meaningful without being overwhelming for a man who had spent decades in solitude. Meanwhile, Frank continued his daily routine, unaware of the incredible outpouring of support building around him. He noticed that people seemed to be looking at him differently lately, offering more smiles and nods, but he attributed it to his imagination. After decades of invisibility, it seemed impossible that anyone would suddenly see him as worthy of attention. Brenda from the grocery store had started calling him by name, something that surprised and pleased him. Mrs. Chen seemed to have more flowers to give away than usual, and even Murphy had started greeting him when he passed by the hardware store. These small changes felt significant to Frank, but he couldn't imagine the scale of what was being planned. Sarah had to be careful not to let her excitement show during their regular conversations in the park. She continued to interview Frank, now focusing on happier memories from his childhood and his dreams for the future. She discovered that Frank had always wanted to visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., but had never been able to afford the trip. This became another element of the surprise being planned for him. The story began to spread beyond the immediate community. Sarah's journalism professor shared Frank's story with colleagues at other universities, and soon veterans advocacy groups across the state were offering their support. A travel company volunteered to provide Frank with a free trip to Washington, D.C., complete with a guided tour of all the military memorials and museums. Local businesses began reaching out with offers of support. The town barber offered free haircuts for life. A clothing store wanted to provide Frank with new clothes. A local restaurant chain proposed free meals. The generosity was overwhelming, and Sarah found herself coordinating a network of support that grew larger every day. The morning of November 11th, Veterans Day, began like any other for Frank. He prepared his modest breakfast of instant coffee and toast, checked his small collection of mail that consisted mostly of bills and advertisements, and got ready for his daily walk to the park. He had no idea that this would be the day that changed everything. As he carefully descended the narrow stairs from his apartment, Frank noticed that Murphy's hardware store seemed busier than usual. There were more cars parked on the street, and he could hear voices coming from inside the shop. He assumed there was some kind of sale or special event, never imagining that he was the reason for all the activity. But as he stepped outside onto the sidewalk, Frank was greeted by a sight that took his breath away and left him frozen in complete disbelief. The entire street was lined with people holding American flags and homemade signs, thanking him for his service. Children who had once whispered about the strange old man were now holding banners with his name on them, their faces bright with excitement and anticipation. Mrs. Chen stood at the front of the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered face as she held a massive bouquet of fresh flowers. Beside her stood Brenda from the grocery store, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for your sacrifice, Frank." Murphy emerged from his hardware store wearing a veteran's cap Frank had never seen before, his own eyes misty with emotion. The mayor stepped forward with a microphone, his voice carrying the weight of a community's long overdue gratitude. Behind him, a platform had been erected, decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and surrounded by American flags that fluttered in the cool November breeze. Frank stood frozen in disbelief, his paper bag of bread for the pigeons falling forgotten from his trembling hands. A military honor guard marched down the street, their crisp uniforms and precise movements a stark contrast to Frank's worn jacket and trembling hands. The sound of their boots hitting the pavement in perfect unison brought back memories of his own military service, when he had been young and strong and proud to wear the uniform of his country. The mayor began reading a proclamation declaring Frank Morrison a hometown hero, his voice breaking with emotion as he recited the details of Frank's service that had been hidden for so long. The Bronze Star citation was read aloud, describing in vivid detail the night Frank had risked his life to save 12 wounded soldiers, carrying them one by one to safety while under continuous enemy fire. As the proclamation continued, more details of Frank's service emerged. He had not only saved lives in combat, but had also volunteered for the most dangerous missions, always putting the safety of his fellow soldiers above his own. He had extended his tour twice, not because he loved war, but because he couldn't bear to leave his unit short-handed when they needed experienced soldiers. But the surprises weren't over. Sarah appeared beside Frank, gently taking his arm, as she explained how his story had touched so many lives. She led him to the decorated platform, where representatives from multiple veterans organizations waited to present him with honors and recognition that were decades overdue. A local news crew captured every moment as Frank struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The contractor, Tom Rodriguez, stepped forward to present Frank with keys to his completely renovated apartment. While Frank had been attending the ceremony, a team of volunteers had transformed his sparse grey living space into a warm, comfortable home. New furniture had replaced his threadbare pieces, modern appliances had been installed in his tiny kitchen, and photos of his military service had been professionally framed and displayed with pride. The bathroom had been updated with safety features for an elderly resident, including grab bars and a walk-in shower. The bedroom now featured a comfortable new bed and a display case for his medals, finally giving them the honored place they deserved. The walls throughout the apartment had been painted in warm colors, and new curtains allowed Frank to control the light while maintaining his privacy. Jennifer Thompson, representing her family's grocery store, handed Frank a special card guaranteeing free groceries for life, along with delivery service so he would never have to struggle with heavy bags again. The local bank manager stepped forward to announce that the community had raised enough money to ensure Frank would never have to worry about bills again, creating a trust fund that would cover all his living expenses and medical needs. Perhaps the most moving moment came when an elderly woman stepped forward, supported by her adult children and grandchildren. She introduced herself as Maria Santos, the same woman who had written the letter Frank still carried in his wallet. She had traveled from California to attend the ceremony, bringing with her the son whose life Frank had saved 50 years earlier. Miguel Santos, now 68 years old and a retired police officer, stepped forward to shake Frank's hand. Through tears, he thanked Frank for the life he had been able to live, for his children and grandchildren, for the career in law enforcement, where he had been able to help others because Frank had first helped him. His mother, Maria, now 91 years old, embraced Frank as she wept, telling him that not a day had passed in 50 years without her family saying a prayer of gratitude for his courage. The reunion was overwhelming for everyone present, but especially for Frank. Here was living proof that his actions had mattered, that the risks he had taken and the prices he had paid had real meaning. Miguel's family included teachers, doctors, police officers, and small business owners, all of whom existed because Frank had been willing to risk everything for a wounded teenager in a distant jungle. Frank's composure finally broke completely. The man who had faced enemy fire with unwavering courage crumbled under the weight of a community's love and gratitude. He wept openly as dozens of people lined up to shake his hand, hug him, and thank him for his service. Children who had once feared him now looked up at him with admiration, seeing him for what he truly was, a hero who had been hiding in plain sight. The celebration continued late into the evening, with local restaurants donating food and the American Legion hosting a formal dinner in Frank's honor. Story after story emerged of how Frank's example of quiet dignity and selfless service had inspired people throughout the community, even those who had never known his background. During the dinner, Sarah stood to present Frank with a special gift, a photo album containing pictures and letters from people around the country who had been touched by his story. Veterans from other wars shared their own experiences of feeling forgotten, thanking Frank for representing all of them. Gold Star mothers wrote to express their gratitude for his service and to let him know that their fallen children would be proud to have served alongside someone like him. The album also contained contemporary photos of the men Frank had served with, information about their lives after the war, and messages from their families. Several of the soldiers he had saved had gone on to successful careers and large families, their children and grandchildren owing their existence to Frank's courage. One had become a doctor, another a teacher, a third had started a successful business that employed hundreds of people. As the evening wound down and Frank was helped up to his transformed apartment, he was no longer the invisible man who had shuffled through the neighborhood for years. He was Frank Morrison, war hero, community treasure, and living reminder of the debt society owes to those who have served. His daily walks to Memorial Park would continue, but now he would be accompanied by neighbors eager to hear his stories and children proud to walk beside a real-life hero. The pigeons at Memorial Park would still receive their daily bread, but now they would share Frank's attention with a community that had finally learned to see the extraordinary man who had been living among them all along. The park itself took on new meaning, no longer just a memorial to the dead, but a gathering place where the living could honor those who had sacrificed for their freedom. In the days following the celebration, Frank received hundreds of letters from veterans and civilians alike. Some thanked him for his military service, but others thanked him for showing them what quiet dignity and perseverance looked like in the face of adversity. His simple act of feeding pigeons at Memorial Park had become a symbol of faithfulness and hope, inspiring others to look more closely at the unsung heroes in their own communities. The hardware store below Frank's apartment became an unofficial pilgrimage site, with visitors coming from across the state to meet the man whose story had captured the nation's attention. Murphy proudly displayed photos of Frank's military service in his front window, along with newspaper clippings documenting the incredible celebration that had changed both their lives forever. Sarah's journalism project evolved into a documentary film that would eventually be shown at veterans' hospitals and community centers across the country. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about how society treats its veterans and the responsibility every community has to care for those who have served. Frank's story became a catalyst for change, inspiring other communities to seek out their own forgotten heroes. Local schools began inviting Frank to speak about his experiences, not just his military service, but his long years of quiet perseverance. He became a living example of how ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts of courage and how true heroism often goes unrecognized for decades. His talks always ended with a challenge to students to look beyond the surface of the people around them, to recognize that everyone has a story worth hearing. Frank Morrison had spent decades believing that his sacrifices had been forgotten, that his service had meant nothing to a world that had moved on without him. In one extraordinary day, he learned that heroism is never truly forgotten. Sometimes it just takes the right person at the right moment to help a community remember what it means to honor those who have given everything for others. The transformation wasn't just in Frank's circumstances, but in his spirit. The man who had once questioned whether his life had any meaning now woke up every morning knowing that his story had touched thousands of lives and inspired countless acts of kindness and recognition. He had become not just a recipient of community love, but a beacon of hope for veterans everywhere who wondered if their sacrifices mattered. Frank's story spread far beyond that small Ohio neighborhood, carried by social media and news outlets to millions of people who were reminded that heroism doesn't always wear a cape or seek the spotlight. It often lives quietly among us, feeding pigeons in a park, shopping carefully with limited funds, and maintaining dignity in the face of neglect and loneliness. Today, Frank continues to live in that small Ohio neighborhood, but his world has expanded far beyond the boundaries of Memorial Park. He speaks at schools, visits veterans' hospitals, and works with Sarah on initiatives to identify and support other forgotten heroes. His daily routine still includes feeding the pigeons, but now he's often accompanied by children who see those simple acts as lessons in compassion and consistency. The story of Frank Morrison reminds us that heroism takes many forms, and that the most profound acts of courage often happen in quiet moments, away from cameras and crowds. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of the people we pass every day, to recognize that extraordinary stories of sacrifice and service might be living right next door, waiting for someone to simply ask and listen. This incredible story of recognition and redemption shows us the power of one person's willingness to see beyond the surface and advocate for those who have been forgotten. Sarah's decision to approach Frank with genuine curiosity transformed not just his life, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to honor our veterans and recognize the heroes walking among us. If Frank Morrison's story has touched your heart and inspired you to look for the unsung heroes in your own community, make sure to subscribe to Top Life Stories for more incredible tales of courage, transformation, and the extraordinary people who walk among us every day. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because everyone deserves to know that their story matters and that recognition, no matter how late, can change everything.